Okay, thank you very much. So my background is not so much in paleography, but in anthropology or linguistic anthropology, and I'm especially interested in how people in small-scale societies make use of graphic codes of any kind, be they non-linguistic sign systems, like this Nashidongba manuscript from Yunnan in China, or this message stick from Australia, or fully kind of glottographic writing, like this new script from New Guinea, and this it's an alphabetic script, and this relatively new mixed system from the Philippines. Writing is something typically associated with state societies that have centralized bureaucracies and hierarchies. I want to know what happens when it's appropriated for use in smaller non-state societies with different kinds of social organization. And one of my core concerns is understanding the phenomenon of new writing systems invented by processes of what's called stimulus diffusion. And this is when non-literate adults who are exposed to the concept of writing are then inspired to invent it for their own languages without any overt instruction from a literate outsider. So they already know what writing is in principle, they reverse engineer it, and they go on to teach their system to new generations of users. And most of you will already be, I think, familiar with the well-known example of the Cherokee script invented by Sequoia. There it is there on top of that sign. But Cherokee is just one of at least 9 scripts that were invented, that came about in the same way that we know of. And there are potentially more than the 9 cases indicated on this map. I just don't have enough historical documentation to determine whether their inventors were, in fact, non-literate at the time that they invented their script. I call these scripts invented by non-literates emergent scripts, by analogy with the term emergent languages, things like Nicaraguan Sign Language. And it's a term that I defend. I'm aware that they get called other things. So here's what they look like up close. And I define emergent scripts as functional writing systems developed by non-literates from minimal stimulus. They can be invented by a single individual or by a group, and they can, of course, undergo reforms or revisions, and in fact they often do. The important thing is they have to be functional, so they have to actually do the work of writing, and the inventors need to be non-literate at the outset, even if they know what literacy means as a general concept. So they're a special class of secondary scripts, if you like. And plenty of people have suspected that emergent scripts have some relevance to paleography and to cultural evolution, including all of these dignified gentlemen here. But so far, this intuition, which I think is a good intuition, has not developed into a solid theoretical framework. So today I'm sketching the outlines of a proposed comparative and theoretical agenda. I'm warning you, this is not a study with results. This is more like a philosophical meander, but I hope a productive one. So it's going to be in broad brushstrokes, and I apologise for being a little bit reductive, but I hope this is also going to be provocative. So the overarching question I want to pose is, what do emergent scripts tell us about writing as a cultural and cognitive artefact? The argument that I'm going to make in this talk is that writing is very hard. It's hard to produce, it's hard to sustain, hard to transmit, without a lot of scaffolding. It needs social scaffolding. In other words, it needs particular kinds of environments to flourish in. It leans on cognitive scaffolding in terms of things like visual preferences, learning constraints, and meta-linguistic awareness. And I think it's fair to say that writing is especially hard to invent de novo, and this is reflected in the fact that it happens so very rarely, whether it comes about from scratch, like the first ever writing systems, or via stimulus diffusion. But despite its historical rarity, writing is often quite desirable. Communities that have it tend to be very attached to it. Communities that don't have it often tend to want it. And I acknowledge with Theo this morning that writing is not like a gas. Nonetheless, it's often desirable, with some fascinating exceptions of people who resist writing, which I won't be talking about, but you can ask me about. But when people acquire writing for the first time, by whatever means, they often end up using it in surprising and counterintuitive ways. The talks that we saw just before give evidence of that. And this is something that intrigues me from an anthropological point of view. So a tributary question to this is, do emergent scripts form a natural set? That is, when you examine their constellations of attributes, do they resolve themselves into a distinctive class of their own? Can you spot one in a crowd? And it's a hard question to tackle empirically because we're talking about a rare phenomenon and there are so few data points for comparison. But my observation is that the inventors do seem to resort to similar strategies for representing language. And what I want to argue is that these strategies might direct us towards better generalizations about how writing emerges and how it evolves. And one thing I'll talk about is how we see some of these strategies at work when we look at how children in literate societies learn how to write for the first time. The question of whether emergent scripts form a natural set leads straight to another question which I think has direct relevance to paleography, and that is, what can modern stimulus diffusion reveal about ancient stimulus diffusion? So we already suspect that comparable Cherokee-like reinventions took place in the ancient world, so we heard from Theo as well, but we usually know very little about how this process unfolded in practice. And again, I thank Theo for this beautiful meme that he let me use, and for illustrating the problem so succinctly. So you can follow him there down the bottom. So I want to suggest that the better documented modern emergent scripts have heuristic value in the analysis of the same process in ancient contexts. But I won't be talking about this today because it's so far a little bit beyond my expertise. What I do want to touch on rather speculatively is the question of what an emergent scripts tell us about pristine inventions, and I'm already updating my terminology and I'm going to call them primary inventions instead. The isolated inventions of writing in these primary sites of Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, and I understand that it's in dispute whether some of these are primary or secondary inventions, but I'm just leaving that there for now. These were, after all, new writing systems, the newest ever in the world, created independently by adult non-literates, one supposes, at least. And I'm going to suggest a few avenues of inquiry here. So back to our emergent scripts. Unlike primary inventions, these 9 emergent scripts were developed in a very tight historical framework between 1821 over there with Cherokee in the US and 1959 with Palaeographers in Vietnam. And this is a period of fast-tracked colonial expansion when non-literate populations are encountering literate populations, mostly from Europe, on an unprecedented scale and pace. It's within this period that we get the scramble for Africa, we get the closing of the American frontier, the total colonization of Indochina, Australia, and the Pacific. It all happens within this time frame, and it's also when we see the backlash in the form of nativist and anti-colonial movements and successful campaigns for self-determination. So paleographers are accustomed to dealing in millennia and centuries, but neographers like me have the advantage of being able to examine more micro-level processes of contact, change, innovation, and political dynamics in terms of decades and even years sometimes. Emergent scripts have the most astonishing individual histories with sensational themes. We get wars and religious cults and escaped slaves and political assassinations and supernatural interventions. But rather than introduce you to the stories of all 9 scripts one by one, I'm just going to tell you very quickly about 3 of them, and the intention is just to give you a mental picture and to show that these scripts are not merely abstract intellectual exercises. They're also products of human ingenuity created under extraordinary conditions. They're products of people, times, and places. So I'm going to be talking about the Bamum script of Cameroon, this one, the Caroline Island script of Micronesia, and the Pouchin House script of the Chin Hills in Burma, now Myanmar. And all were created, all were created in this very productive decade between 1895 and 1905, but in very different parts of the world and in different circumstances. So the Bamum script was invented by the non-literate King Njoya of Cameroon with the help of his court in 1895 in response to a revelational dream. It went through 5 distinct versions from a very logographic and figurative script of about 500 about 500 characters to an ultra-compact phonetic script of around 80 largely syllabic characters. And this happened in a period of about 15 years. So you can see kind of just impressionistically the changes to the script, the reduction in the sign inventory, and also the letters become much more sort of abstract. This is just to give you the contrast between 1895 and 1910. Okay. So the Caroline Island script, invented around the same time, on Irapic Atoll in Micronesia, was prompted by a shipwrecked missionary, Alfred Snelling, who began teaching people the Roman alphabet, but he left the island after a few months and he died very quickly after that. The people of Irapic on this atoll here did not succeed in learning the Roman alphabet, but they did learn about writing. Subsequently, over on the nearby Faralep atoll, a group of 5 women and men, whose names we still know, developed an alpha-syllabic system of 78 characters for their Walia language. You can see some examples there. So in 1902, so more or less exactly the same time, the Pauchin-Hao or Zotwa Lai script was created in Burma by an aspiring prophet. Have I got it? Yes. By the name of Pauchin-Hao, and he had received a number of sacred revelations foretelling new technologies and devastating wars, and he experienced a vision of an Englishman who instructed him in the art of writing, and in this vision the stones were representing letters. The first version of the script is a logography of 1,050 signs, and those are some examples there. There was a second revised version which is now lost, and finally, in 1931, he produced an alphabet. And today, both scripts are used sometimes together. So this book shows you you can see the logographic script on the top, the alphabetic script in the middle, and then a Roman transliteration underneath, just to give you a comparison. Okay. So I invite you to imagine similar patterns of events in these other times and other environments. I'm not going to go into them all. So the circumstances of contact and reinvention are, on the surface, quite diverse, but there are a few overarching commonalities. We have disruptive and unequal colonial encounters in which incoming literate groups are in the process of dominating indigenous non-literate groups. The non-literate groups are already using non-linguistic graphic codes of some kind. Inventors are often technical specialists, so there's an over-representation of weavers, jewelers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and that sort of thing. Origin stories often involve dream revelations that deny agency to the inventors, and as we heard from Cecile today, this idea of discovery rather than invention is a theme. They end up also getting bound, sort of later on, sometimes getting bound to new institutions introduced from the outside or innovated within the society, also in Cecile's talk, and usually political and religious institutions. But I want to now zoom in on the scripts themselves. There's a lot of commentary to the effect, sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. There's a lot of commentary to the effect that non-literate inventors have a habit of inventing syllabaries and not alphabets. And it said that the reason they do this is because syllables have psychological reality, we can articulate them on demand, but phonemes are abstract analytical concepts that don't come naturally to non-literates, including pre-literate children. And I think there is some merit there, but in its strictest form, it doesn't hold true. And in fact, the Caroline Islands script and the Pawamong script are not syllabaries; they are in fact alpha syllabaries. And I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that there's a lot more to language than phonemes versus syllables, and therefore there's more to writing than how these phonological units get organised. So looking only at the underlying systems of each emergent script, what we observe is they tend to target morphology, in my opinion, with phoneticism coming into play almost as a byproduct. So the first drafts of these scripts are either fully logographic, meaning one sign per morpheme, or a significant proportion of their sign inventory is given over to logograms or logosyllabograms. We do get phoneticism, there's no doubt about that, but I think morphology seems to be a significant target of early glottographic representation. So you might remember that Cherokee is apparently fully phonetic syllabary, but what's been handed down to us is in fact Cherokee B. There was a previous version, Cherokee A, which was a logographic script, preceded Cherokee B by 10 years. It has been lost. So they're morpheme-centric. And I just thought this is a nice way of illustrating that these signs do not have phonetic content. But what I'm going to show you actually is that the direction seems to be opposite. So, it's to the way that Prince did it. So he lost phoneticism, but what did he do? So he started with phoneticism and lost it, but it tends to go the other way with emergent scripts. So when phoneticism comes into play, the preference is certainly for syllables over phonemes. I accept that much. And emergent writing systems tend to stay consonant-centric, underrepresenting vowels, tones, and supersegmentals. We do, of course, see this in other writing systems in the world, but my impression, at least, is especially salient in emergent systems, this preference for marking consonants, especially syllable initial ones, and it's something to explore further. Consonant-centric. Occasionally, they make use of rebuses and semantic determinatives to distinguish homophones. So, quick examples of lovely, iconically derived rebuses from the Caroline Islands script. I can't remember all of them, but right up there, ng is representing bamboo, and it's also the sound for bamboo. Boil, as in an ulcer. That's an outrigger canoe, a mast, a sail. This is fish bones, fish bottle, breast, saw, and sprouting coconut is my favourite one. There's a few more. I haven't isolated them all. Okay. In Bamum, we get semantic determinative that distinguishes homophonic signs by marking the higher status concept. Sorry, I haven't got the reference here. It's to Gus and Jeffries, 1950-ish. But we've got this sign here, which looks suspiciously like a Sora sign, right? This one here. That's the semantic determinative. And so here, the higher status concept is drum, and so it's distinguishing it from its homophone, which stands for ruins. Higher status is also attributed to it has an animacy hierarchy too. So anything that is animate or associated with living, things like antelope, blood, for example, as opposed to weak, it's going to get marked as the high status concept. Okay. So later, wherever we have diachronic evidence for changes in the script over time, we see that logograms drop away. And here's what happens, for example, to logosyllabograms in the Vai script. There's at least 21, so it's a bit of a rough chart to read, but there's at least 21 in the 1840s, so shortly after the script is invented. But by 1981, there's only 3. And they're not just desemanticizing, they're actually getting dropped. And as a result, the grapheme inventories of emergent writing systems shrink because they're targeting smaller linguistic units. So increased phoneticism and smaller grapheme inventories is something that seems to happen over time. It's worth mentioning that we get similar effects in language evolution experiments. So Simon Kirby's experiments in Edinburgh with artificial languages created in controlled interactions show that people innovate languages with huge lexicons with one word per meaning, but when they need to transmit their language to another experimental generation, there's pressure to streamline, to compress, and to systematize. Okay, on to the graphic dimension. So when it comes to the script, so the outward form of the letters, emergent scripts are characterized by initial high visual complexity relative to other writing systems in the world. And this can, in fact, be measured and demonstrated, for example, by my colleague Helena Midon, who's doing a big kind of study of relative visual complexity controlling for script phylogenies and so on. So she's got this set of what she calls idiosyncratic scripts, which is not just emergent scripts, but any secondary invention. And so far what she's found is higher visual complexity. They often make extensive use of iconicity, informed by usually informed by existing figurative traditions, or even what I'm calling indirect iconicity, where the script is visually modelled on another script, but the sound values are different. So famously, Cherokee, with it being modelled on Roman, but with different sound values. But also we get Roman, for example, influence, and Japanese, interestingly, influence in the Caroline Islands script, in Masaba, which I haven't talked about, influence, sort of morphological influence from Arabic, and in Pouchin how later versions are very much influenced by Burmese in their forms. Where we have available documentation, we see a great deal of variation and change in the individual letter forms over time. So they are not particularly stable, especially at the outset, and the writing direction is also variable. It seems to, in many cases, it's optional whether you want to write left to right or right to left. And related to this writing direction thing, we don't tend to get letters that contrast in symmetry or rotation. In other words, we don't get these forms like Roman lowercase p and q or b and d. And that makes sense if you understand that orientation is variable. And then later, so we're still on graphic complexity, no contrast in reverse and rotated images. We get, in the course of regular use and transmission, we find visual complexity decreasing significantly, and this is something that I've demonstrated with some of my colleagues in a paper on the Vai script that's under review, but I've got a few pretty pictures. So this is showing, we measured the visual complexity of Vai letters over 171 years, and you can see this kind of drop here. I can go into the methods of that if you like afterwards. There you can see some of these trajectories, and there's a kind of a banding effect. So not only does visual complexity drop off, but the letters kind of become more self-similar. Okay. So I think there's a lot to discuss and unpack here. I do want to say briefly that I think there are trade-offs happening in these linguistic and graphic dimensions. So consider for a moment just how difficult it is to invent writing when you yourself can't write anything down. You can't simply draw up two columns and say, oh, here are my beautiful symbols that I'm inventing, and here are the sound values, because that presupposes that you've already got writing in order to be able to do that. So there's a huge burden on memory to retain all these sound meaning mappings, especially if you're dealing with logographic system with hundreds upon hundreds of signs. It's almost like having to learn a new language. But even a syllabic system is going to be a stretch. So things like iconicity, I suggest, are going to make life a little bit easier. And visual complexity too, I think at the outset helps the invention process, because you can make each sign maximally distinctive. But it's a drag on learning and transmission and production. You don't want to keep writing out very complex signs if you don't need to. And that's one of the reasons why I think emergent scripts actually simplify. Okay, so I want to make a super quick digression that I think reinforces some of the points I've made regarding linguistic and graphic dimensions in emergent scripts. There's a terrific book by Rebecca Tryman and Brett Kessler. I encourage you to read it, How Children Learn to Write Words. Importantly, it's not about how they learn to read and process writing, about which much has already been written, but how they actually produce it. And it turns out that pre-literate kids end up implementing many of the same strategies as the non-literate inventors of emergent scripts, which for me I think suggests certain cognitive biases. The authors point out that even before kids find themselves in a classroom for the first time or have any explicit instruction, they already have certain understandings about what writing is, how it works, and how to reproduce it. And their early unassisted attempts to write bring these preconceptions into focus. For example, we get a lot of this unbroken kind of scripta continua thing going on. Variable writing direction, mirror image and variable rotation of letters, also iconicity, and the reanalysis of phonemic letters as syllabic or morphosyllabic. And as children learn to write, they abandon iconicity as a strategy for writing also abandoned it as a hypothesis for how writing works. Okay. There's a lot more to say here about this comparison with emergent scripts. There are also caveats given that pre-literate children are not as linguistically and cognitively mature as non-literate adults, and I'm also aware of a danger of reproducing progressivist cliches about non-literate Indigenous people being childlike in their supposed incapacity for abstraction and so on. But I do think this can be explored. So finally, I just want to bring this all back to primary inventions. Have I got a slide? No, I don't. On the face of it, I think we notice some areas of overlap with these emergent scripts and the first ever writing systems. For example, in both categories of scripts, we get lots of logograms and we get consonant centricity, I think, or if you want to put it another way, underrepresentation of vowels. We also find rebuses as well as semantic determinatives, and we get a fair bit of iconicity. So again, nailing down these correspondences in a robust or statistical way can be a problem with so few independent points of comparison. But I think this gives us a clue or suggests hypotheses that might be tested about the first writing systems. And I think visual complexity is number one in terms of its testability. And if it's true that emergent and primary scripts are converging on the same solutions for representing language, where does this lead us? I think it suggests that writing is, as I mentioned, a difficult technology to produce and sustain. It's cultivated in very specific social and semiotic environments. It relies on an intuitive metalinguistic awareness, particularly of morphophonology, and it's helped along by visual preferences for relatively figurative, relatively complex shapes that give way to more compressed forms under, I think, learning and transmission pressures. These are the commonalities, but there are also some very striking differences between emergent and primary scripts. Some of these differences, I think, are quite instructive, and one which interests me is that emergent scripts seem to develop really fast. In the space of decades or even years, you get quite rapid changes, sometimes unconscious changes that come about in the process of transmission, sometimes intentional reforms and interventions. And this is something that Gelb, Gelb noticed, and he explained it in his own, I'm calling that compression. Gelb explained this observation in his own quaintly racist way. But contrary to Gelb, my explanation is that stimulus diffusion as a process gives you a leg up. Inventors of emergent scripts already knew that writing could be used for asynchronous communication over distance and over time, while primary inventors did not necessarily know this, and it in some cases took them a long time to figure it out. They also knew that writing could be used to facilitate trade, for claiming authority, and for organising populations. And when you know ahead of time what the potential results are, perhaps you're going to keep inventing and optimising your technology until you achieve that end, especially if what you're trying to invent is recognised as a source of political power. My Ukrainian colleague said, it's a bit like when you learn that your neighbours have an atomic bomb, you're going to work overtime until you've got one too. And it certainly helps, I think, to be part of a state society because that lowers the barriers for entry into literacy, since you can invest in institutional mechanisms for teaching and transmission. But non-state societies can do it too, and do it very successfully, such that many of these emergent scripts are still being used and transmitted to this day. Okay, thank you.